Hi everyone. Welcome to Life Story. Today, I'm excited to share a new story with you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the weathered barn as Garrett Wilson stood, hands on hips, surveying the land that now belonged to him. At 26, armed with a law degree from a prestigious university and dreams of a corner office in a sleek city skyscraper, he had never imagined he'd end up here, inhaling the pungent scent of manure and listening to the distant lowing of cattle. "Well, Mom and Dad," he muttered, glancing skyward, "I hope you're happy. Your city slicker son is home to stay." It had been 6 months since the accident that claimed both his parents. 6 months filled with grief, stacks of legal paperwork, and agonizing decisions. Now here he was, the reluctant heir to a struggling family farm in the heart of rural America. Garrett ran a hand through his sandy hair, grimacing as he felt the calluses forming on his once soft palms. He had traded his tailored suits for worn jeans and work boots, his leather briefcase for a toolbox. The transition hadn't been easy. "Garrett, you out here?" called the voice of his elderly neighbor, Mrs. Avery, carrying across the field. "Over here, Mrs. A," he called back, forcing a smile as the wizened old woman made her way toward him, a covered dish in her hands. "Brought you some of my famous apple pie," she said, thrusting the dish at him. "Lord knows you need some meat on those bones. Your mama would be fit to be tied if she saw how skinny you've gotten." Garrett accepted the pie with genuine gratitude. "Thanks, Mrs. A. You didn't have to do that." The old woman's eyes softened. "Of course I did. Boy, we take care of our own around here. Now you eat that up. And don't you be too proud to ask for help when you need it. Running a farm ain't no easy task, especially for a city boy like yourself." As Mrs. Avery tottered back toward her own property, Garrett felt a lump form in his throat. The kindness of his neighbors, the weight of his parents' legacy, it all pressed heavily on him. He may not have chosen this life, but he was determined to make it work. Setting the pie aside, he rolled up his sleeves and got to work. There were fences to mend, animals to feed, and crops to tend. The day stretched long before him, filled with backbreaking labor and a steep learning curve. By nightfall, Garrett collapsed into the worn armchair in the farmhouse living room, every muscle aching. He glanced around at the familiar surroundings, the faded family photos on the mantel, his mother's cherished knickknacks, and his father's old guitar propped in the corner. This was home now, for better or worse. As he drifted off to sleep, Garrett couldn't shake the feeling that he was in over his head. But deep down, beneath the doubt and fear, there was a tiny spark of determination. He was a Wilson, after all, and Wilsons didn't give up without a fight. Little did Garrett know, the challenges of running a farm were about to become the least of his worries. A storm was brewing in the sleepy little town, and Garrett was about to find himself right in the eye of it. The first hints of trouble came on a balmy Tuesday night in late August. Garrett was jolted awake by the frantic barking of his border collie, Max, stumbling out of bed. He peered out the window to see his neighbor, Old Man Johnson, running across the field in his pajamas, waving a flashlight wildly. "What in the world?" Garrett muttered, quickly pulling on his boots and grabbing a jacket. As he stepped out onto the porch, the cool night air hit him, carrying with it the sounds of distant shouting and the occasional bleat of distressed sheep. Something was very wrong. "Johnson," Garrett called out as the old man approached. "What's going on?" Johnson, red-faced and panting, leaned on the porch railing. "It's happened again. Boy, 3 of my best sheep, gone without a trace. And I ain't the only one. The Petersons lost a couple of lambs. And I heard the Marts are missing a whole herd of goats." Garrett's mind raced. This wasn't the first time he'd heard whispers of missing livestock, but never on this scale. "Have you called the sheriff?" Johnson snorted. "Fat lot of good that'll do. They'll just tell us to keep a better eye on our animals. No, we need to take matters into our own hands. There's a town meeting at the community center in an hour. You coming?" Garrett nodded. His law school training might not have prepared him for farm life, but it had taught him how to think critically and seek solutions. Something strange was happening, and he was determined to get to the bottom of it. The community center buzzed with tension as Garrett joined the crowd of concerned farmers. Accusations flew. ranging from wild animals to organized theft. But no one had any concrete answers. Some suggested setting up cameras, a proposal that drew scoffs from the more skeptical attendees. But Garrett, seeing no better option, decided to install a few on his own property. A week later, Garrett sat down to review the footage from his newly installed barn camera. What he saw made his blood run cold. Figures cloaked in darkness moved with eerie precision, leading the livestock away under the cover of night. The chilling realization hit him. This wasn't the work of wild animals. It was something far more sinister. He hurried to show the footage to the sheriff, who, faced with undeniable proof, launched a full-scale investigation. As word spread through the town, the once skeptical neighbors began to rally around Garrett. Together, they devised a plan to catch the culprits in the act. On a moonless night, Garrett and a group of determined townsfolk waited in silence, armed with cameras, flashlights, and sheer resolve. When the mysterious figures returned, they were met with a united front. The criminals, exposed and outnumbered, had no choice but to surrender. In the days that followed, Garrett became a local hero. The farm, once a source of doubt and struggle, now symbolized resilience and community. As he stood in the barn, the morning sun streaming through the cracks, Garrett felt a newfound sense of purpose. He wasn't just a reluctant farmer anymore. He was a Wilson, and this was his home. Garrett's brain clicked into gear as he dressed quickly, ready to head to the community center. An hour later, he found himself crammed into the stuffy room, shoulder to shoulder with what seemed like half the town. The air was thick with tension, and the musky scent of too many bodies packed into too small a space hung heavy. At the front of the room stood Stuart Blackwood, the de facto leader of the town by virtue of owning the largest farm in the county. His craggy face was lined with grim determination as he called the meeting to order. "Folks, we've got ourselves a situation," Stuart began, his gravelly voice cutting through the murmurs. In the past month, over 50 head of livestock, sheep, goats, even some calves, have gone missing. Now, I know times are tough, and folks might be tempted to do desperate things, but this has got to stop. The room erupted in angry voices, each farmer eager to share their tale of woe. Garrett stood quietly, listening as the details unfolded. The thefts always occurred at night, with no blood or signs of struggle, just animals vanishing into thin air. It was as if the earth had swallowed them whole. "What about Pete?" a voice shouted from the back. "Ain't it his job to watch the herds?" All eyes turned to Pete Murphy, the town's longtime shepherd, slumped in a corner nursing what was clearly not his first drink of the evening. Pete's bleary eyes widened as he realized he was the center of attention. "Now, see here," he slurred, struggling to his feet. "I ain't seen nothing out of the ordinary. Animals wander off sometimes, that's all. Ain't my fault if you can't keep track of your own stock." Chaos erupted as several farmers lunged toward Pete, shouting accusations. Garrett instinctively stepped between the mob and the drunken shepherd, his lawyer instincts kicking in. "Hold on, everyone," he shouted, raising his hands. "This isn't helping. We need a plan, not a witch hunt." Stuart nodded approvingly. "The boy's right. I've been in touch with Frank Harding. He's agreed to do some night patrols and see if he can't catch our thief in the act." A murmur of approval rippled through the crowd. Frank, a renowned hunter with a sharp eye and a reputation for getting results, seemed like the perfect man for the job. As the meeting broke up, Garrett couldn't shake a nagging unease. Animals didn't just disappear without a trace, and no ordinary thief could pull off so many heists without leaving evidence. Walking home under the starlit sky, Garrett made a decision. He'd keep his own vigil. Whatever was happening in this sleepy town felt like the beginning of something much bigger and much more dangerous. Frank Harding, a man of few words and fewer friends, preferred the company of trees to people. He thrived on challenges, and when Stuart approached him about the livestock thefts, Frank saw it as just another problem to conquer. On a moonless night in early September, Frank set up his stakeout at the edge of the forest bordering the town's farmland. Armed with his trusty rifle and years of experience, he was confident no man or beast could slip past him undetected. The hours crept by in tense silence. the night air filled with the chirping of crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl. Frank's keen eyes scanned the darkness for any sign of movement. Just as the first light of dawn began to streak the sky, he saw it, a shadowy figure moving with unnatural grace along the tree line. His heart pounded as he raised his rifle, peering through the scope. What he saw made his blood run cold. The figure was humanoid, but moved in ways no human should, loping on all fours one moment and walking upright the next. Its eyes, catching the faint glow of the rifle's scope, glowed an eerie, unnatural green. Frank's finger trembled on the trigger. In all his years of hunting, he'd never seen anything like this. Was it a man, a beast, or something entirely different? Before he could decide, the creature turned its head and looked directly at him. A low, guttural sound, not quite a growl, not quite a moan, echoed through the trees. Then, in the blink of an eye, it vanished, melting into the shadows as if it had never been there. Frank sat frozen, his heart pounding in his ears. When he finally found the courage to move, he packed up his gear with shaking hands and headed straight for the nearest bar. By noon, the town was buzzing with his story. Some dismissed it as drunken ramblings. Others crossed themselves and muttered about demons and monsters. But one thing was clear. Whatever was out there wasn't human. Stewart listened intently as Frank recounted the encounter, his craggy face betraying no emotion. "We'll set more patrols," he said grimly. "And Garrett, you keep an eye on your land. Something tells me this isn't over." The town began to buzz with a mixture of fear and fascination, each new night bringing the promise of more sightings and unanswered questions. Garrett installed cameras on his property, determined to capture whatever was out there. As he reviewed the footage in the weeks to come, the truth slowly began to reveal itself, a chilling mystery that would test the courage and unity of the entire town. Human, though the figure moved with an unusual combination of stealth and urgency. Garrett held his breath, watching as the person crept toward the barn. This time, he wasn't content to sit and observe. Quietly, he reached for the flashlight and his phone, ready to confront the intruder and capture evidence. As the figure approached the barn door, Garrett flipped on the flashlight, the sudden beam cutting through the darkness like a blade. "Stop right there," he shouted, his voice firm but shaking slightly from adrenaline. The figure froze, momentarily blinded by the light. Garrett took a cautious step forward, his heart pounding. "Who are you? What are you doing on my property?" he demanded. Slowly, the figure lowered their hood, revealing a young woman with disheveled hair and eyes wide with fear. She raised her hands defensively. "Please, don't call the cops," she pleaded. "I can explain." Garrett blinked in surprise. He hadn't expected this. "Start talking," he said, keeping the flashlight trained on her. The woman took a shaky breath. "My name is Clara. I didn't mean to cause any trouble. I've just been trying to survive." She glanced nervously toward the barn. "I've been staying in the woods, scavenging what I can. I only came here because I thought it was abandoned at night." "Survive?" Garrett repeated, lowering the flashlight slightly. "Why are you out here? What's going on?" Clara hesitated, her gaze darting around as if searching for an escape route. Finally, she sighed and met his eyes. "I'm on the run," she admitted, "from someone dangerous. I didn't mean to involve anyone, but I didn't have anywhere else to go." Garrett studied her, his lawyer instincts kicking in as he parsed her words and body language. She didn't seem like a typical thief. There was no malice in her eyes, only desperation. "You've been taking livestock, haven't you?" he asked bluntly. Clara nodded, shame flickering across her face. "I didn't want to, but I had no choice. I've been feeding myself and someone else." "Someone else?" Garrett pressed. She hesitated again, then whispered, "My younger brother. He's sick. We've been hiding out, trying to stay off the grid. If he gets caught, they'll take him away from me." Garrett frowned, his mind racing. This was more complicated than he'd imagined. "Who's after you?" he asked. "Why would they take your brother?" Clara shook her head. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you. Just, please, don't call the authorities. I'll leave. You'll never see me again." Garrett stepped back, his thoughts spinning. He'd expected a thief, not a woman on the run with a sick sibling. He didn't know what to believe, but he couldn't just turn her away. "You don't have to run," he said finally. "Not yet. At least, let me help you." Clara's eyes widened. "Why would you do that?" "Because I know what it's like to feel like you're in over your head," Garrett replied. "And because I believe in giving people a chance." Her shoulders sagged with relief, but she still looked wary. "You're serious? You'd help a stranger like me?" "Let's start with breakfast," Garrett said, gesturing toward the house. "We'll figure out the rest after you tell me everything." Clara hesitated, then nodded, following him toward the farmhouse. As they walked, Garrett's mind churned with questions. Who was chasing Clara? Why was her brother sick? And most importantly, how had they managed to evade everyone for so long? Inside, over steaming mugs of coffee and plates of scrambled eggs, Clara began to tell her story. She spoke of a shadowy organization, of experiments and cover-ups, and of how she and her brother had fled to escape becoming pawns in a sinister game. Garrett listened intently, his skepticism gradually replaced by concern. Her story was incredible, but something in her tone, in her haunted expression, convinced him she was telling the truth. By the time the sun fully rose, Garrett knew one thing for certain. This was bigger than stolen livestock. Clara and her brother weren't just survivors. They were victims of something much darker. And somehow, Garrett had found himself right in the middle of it. As Clara finished her story, Garrett leaned back in his chair, the weight of her words sinking in. "We're going to need a plan," he said finally. "If what you're saying is true, staying in the woods isn't safe anymore." Clara nodded, her expression a mix of gratitude and fear. "What do we do?" "We start by finding your brother," Garrett replied, "and then we figure out how to keep both of you safe." Outside, the morning light bathed the farm in a golden glow, but Garrett couldn't shake the feeling that a storm was brewing. Whatever Clara had brought to his doorstep, it was far from over, and for the first time since he'd inherited the farm, Garrett felt a purpose bigger than himself. Garrett exhaled deeply, trying to process the weight of Toby's revelation. The boy sitting before him, injured and silent, had unknowingly pulled him into a storm that was far more complex than stolen livestock. Garrett leaned back in his chair, studying Toby's face, the sharp angles of his jawline, the tired eyes that mirrored a life lived far too hard for someone his age. "Toby," Garrett said, choosing his words carefully, "you've got to understand, if what you're saying is true, this changes everything, not just for you, but for Stuart, for the whole town." Toby nodded again, his expression a mix of determination and fear. He picked up the pen and notepad, scribbling hastily before pushing the paper toward Garrett. "I don't want to hurt anyone. I just needed to know. I'll leave if I have to. I promise." Garrett shook his head. "You can't just run, Toby. Not anymore. If you leave, you'll only end up back in the same place, searching for answers. And Stuart," he paused, his jaw tightening. "He has a right to know, whether he wants to or not." Toby's hand trembled as he wrote again. "You don't know him. He won't believe me. He'll call me a liar. Or worse." Garrett leaned forward, his voice firm but kind. "Maybe, but he's also someone who's built his life on being the backbone of this community. He values loyalty, honesty, even if it's uncomfortable. And if you're really his son, you deserve to be acknowledged." Toby's gaze dropped to the table, his fingers clutching the edges of the notepad. Garrett could see the boy's fear, of rejection, of being cast aside again, but he could also see a flicker of hope. "Let me help you," Garrett offered. "We'll approach Stuart together. But first, I need to understand everything, every detail. If we're going to confront him, we need to be prepared." Toby hesitated, then began writing once more. This time, his story poured out in halting sentences and jagged letters. Garrett read each word with growing anger and sadness. Toby recounted how his mother, Laura, had worked on Stuart's farm as a teenager, where she had fallen for the older, charming farmer. When she became pregnant, Stuart had denied responsibility, cutting her out of his life entirely. Left alone, Laura had struggled to raise Toby in secrecy, her shame and fear keeping her isolated. Her deathbed confession had been Toby's first real clue to his heritage. A hastily scrawled note and an old photograph of Stuart, now creased and faded. Toby's search for his father had led him to this town, but fear of rejection had kept him in the shadows. By the time Toby finished, Garrett's hands were clenched into fists on the table. "I can't believe he could do something like this," Garrett said, his voice low. "Stuart Blackwood, the town's golden boy. But you've been through hell." Toby shrugged, his expression resigned. He wrote quickly, "It doesn't matter now. I'll leave. I shouldn't have come." Garrett slammed his hand on the table, startling Toby. "No, you're not leaving. This isn't just about you anymore. It's about the truth. Stuart needs to answer for what he's done. If he's half the man he pretends to be, he'll do right by you." The words hung heavy in the air. Garrett stood, pacing the room. "We'll go to him tomorrow. First thing. I'll call my neighbor to keep an eye on the farm while we're gone." Toby looked uncertain, but nodded reluctantly. Garrett knew he was taking a risk, but deep down, he felt it was the right thing to do. That night, Garrett barely slept. His mind churned with possibilities. Stuart denying everything, the town turning against Toby, the scandal that would undoubtedly follow. But every time doubt crept in, he reminded himself of the boy's haunted eyes, the desperation in his story. Toby deserved more than a life spent hiding in the shadows. The following morning, Garrett loaded Toby into his truck, making sure his injured leg was propped comfortably on a spare blanket. The drive to Stuart's sprawling property was tense, the silence broken only by the hum of the engine. Garrett glanced at Toby, who stared out the window, his hands clenched tightly in his lap. As they pulled into the long gravel driveway, Garrett spotted Stuart standing near the barn, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the morning sun. The man exuded authority, his weathered face a mask of control. "Stay close," Garrett said, his voice steady. "We'll do this together." Stuart turned as they approached, his brows furrowing at the sight of Garrett and the boy. "Garrett," he greeted, his tone cautious. "What's this about?" Garrett stepped forward, his resolve firm. "Stuart, we need to talk. It's important." Stuart's gaze shifted to Toby, narrowing slightly. "And who's this?" "This," Garrett said, his voice steady, "is Toby, and according to him, he's your son." Stuart's face went pale, his jaw tightening. "What kind of nonsense is this?" "It's not nonsense," Garrett shot back. "He has proof, and he has a right to be heard." Toby took a shaky step forward, pulling the photograph from his pocket. His hands trembled as he held it out to Stuart, who stared at it in stunned silence. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Stuart looked up, his eyes meeting Toby's. "You're Laura's boy," he said hoarsely, his voice cracking under the weight of recognition. Garrett watched as the truth began to sink in, rippling through Stuart like a stone dropped into still water. Whatever came next, Garrett knew one thing. The town's secrets were about to come to light, and nothing would ever be the same. Must confront Stuart directly. He can't hide from this anymore. And you deserve the truth. Toby, no more secrets. Toby hesitated, his pencil hovering over the notepad, his brows furrowed as if he was deciding whether he could trust this plan. Finally, he scribbled, "What if he denies it? Or worse, throws me out?" Garrett reached across the table, gripping Toby's shoulder firmly. "Then we'll deal with it together. You're not alone in this. And if Stuart's the man everyone believes him to be, he'll step up. He has to." Toby gave a hesitant nod, though Garrett could see the fear lingering in his eyes. The weight of decades of secrets bore down on both of them as Garrett began planning their next move. The following morning, the two stood outside Stuart Blackwood's imposing farmhouse. Its grandeur was a stark reminder of the influence Stuart wielded in the community. But Garrett didn't let it intimidate him. He knocked firmly on the door, the sound echoing in the crisp morning air. After a few tense moments, the door creaked open to reveal Stuart himself. His weathered face was unreadable, though his sharp eyes flicked between Garrett and Toby with a glimmer of suspicion. "Garrett," he greeted coolly, "what brings you here? And who's this?" Garrett took a deep breath, stepping forward. "Stuart, this is Toby." We need to talk. And it's not a conversation you're going to want to avoid. Stuart's gaze settled on Toby, narrowing slightly. What's this about? His tone was guarded, but there was an undercurrent of unease. This is about the past, Garrett said firmly. About Laura, and about Toby. At the mention of Laura's name, Stuart stiffened, his jaw clenched, and for a moment, Garrett thought he might deny everything outright. Instead, Stuart stepped back, gesturing for them to come inside. They followed him into a study lined with shelves of books and framed photographs. Stuart leaned against his desk, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. I'm listening. Garrett glanced at Toby, who stood frozen, clutching his notepad like a lifeline. Taking the lead, Garrett said, Toby is Laura's son, and from everything we've uncovered, he's also your son. Stuart's face darkened. That's a hell of an accusation, he said coldly. What proof do you have? Toby stepped forward, his hands shaking as he held out the photograph of Laura and Stuart. The edges were worn, the image faded, but the truth was unmistakable. Stuart's eyes flickered as he stared at the photo, his stern facade cracking ever so slightly. That was a long time ago, he said quietly, his voice laced with something Garrett couldn't quite place. Regret? Perhaps. But this doesn't prove anything. Toby scribbled furiously on his notepad, then thrust it towards Stuart. She told me about you. On her deathbed, she said you were my father. She kept this photo as proof. Stuart read the note, his hand trembling slightly. He set the notepad down and looked at Toby for a long moment. You look like her, he murmured, almost to himself. The same eyes. The room fell silent, the air heavy with unspoken words. Finally, Stuart exhaled deeply, running a hand through his graying hair. If this is true, if you really are my son, then I've failed you. Toby's eyes filled with tears, but he stood his ground, his chin held high. He wrote again, I didn't come here to ruin your life. I just wanted to know where I came from, to know if I mattered to you at all. Stuart's expression softened, and for the first time, Garrett saw the cracks in the man's armor. You matter, Stuart said, his voice thick with emotion. More than you know. I was a coward back then, and I let my family's influence dictate my choices. I didn't stand up for Laura, and for that, I'll never forgive myself, but I want to make it right. Toby, if you'll let me. Toby hesitated, then nodded slowly. The tension in the room began to ease, replaced by a tentative hope. Garrett felt a sense of relief wash over him, but he knew this was only the beginning. Stuart turned to Garrett, his expression grim. Thank you for bringing him here, for not letting me hide from this. Garrett nodded. He deserves to be part of your life, Stuart, and the truth deserves to come out. In the weeks that followed, Stuart began to integrate Toby into his life, introducing him to the Blackwood family and the farm. It wasn't an easy transition. There were questions, whispers, and even resistance from some corners of the town. But Stuart faced it all head-on, determined to make amends for the years of silence. Garrett watched it all unfold with a mixture of pride and satisfaction. Toby was no longer the frightened boy hiding in the shadows. He was finding his place, his voice, and his family. One evening, as Garrett stood on his porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, Toby joined him. He handed Garrett a note. Thank you for believing in me. I wouldn't have found him without you. Garrett smiled, ruffling Toby's hair. You're part of this town now, Toby, and no matter what happens, you've got people here who care about you. As the stars began to twinkle above, Garrett felt a sense of peace he hadn't known since he'd first returned to the farm. Life in their sleepy little town would never be the same. But for the first time, it felt like it was changing for the better. Relationship had blossomed into something more. Garrett smiled warmly as she approached, tucking a stray lock of hair behind her ear. It's hard not to admire it when you see the results, he said, but I think I owe a lot of it to your advice. Hannah laughed, shaking her head. You give me too much credit. Garrett, you're the one putting in the hard work. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of footsteps pounding toward them. Toby came running from the barn, his face flushed with excitement, holding up a small notebook. He waved it eagerly before handing it to Garrett. "What is it, Toby?" Garrett asked, flipping through the pages. Toby had been working on a drawing of their farm, carefully sketching the layout with remarkable precision. Garrett's heart swelled with pride as he looked at the detailed depiction. "This is amazing," he said, ruffling Toby's hair. "You're really talented, kid." Toby beamed, then scribbled on his notepad. "I want to help more. Maybe design something for the farm?" Garrett nodded. "We'll make it happen. You've got great ideas." Hannah crouched beside Toby, examining the sketch. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "with talent like this, Toby, you might think about architecture or engineering. This is professional level work." Toby's eyes lit up, and he glanced at Garrett for confirmation. "She's right," Garrett said. "If that's something you're interested in, we can figure out how to make it happen." The moment was interrupted by the sound of a truck pulling into the driveway. It was Mrs. Avery, the ever-watchful neighbor, stepping out with her signature basket of baked goods. "Thought I'd bring you boys some lunch," she said, her sharp eyes surveying the trio. "And Hannah, good to see you here, keeping Garrett in line. I hope." Hannah chuckled. "I try my best, Mrs. Avery." The group settled on the porch with sandwiches and fresh lemonade. As they ate, they talked about the changes in the town. The wounds from Stuart Blackwood's downfall were healing, albeit slowly. The farmers had banded together, creating a tighter-knit community than ever before. The Blackwood farm was now under new management, with many of its resources being redirected to support local initiatives. "Funny how things work out," Mrs. Avery mused, taking a sip of lemonade. "This town was on the brink of falling apart a year ago. Now it feels like we've found our way again. And I think we have you to thank for that, Garrett." Garrett shook his head modestly. "It wasn't just me. A lot of people stepped up when it mattered. And Toby, he's the real reason things changed. He brought us the truth." Toby smiled shyly. "Writing. We did it together." As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a warm glow over the fields, Garrett felt a deep sense of peace. He glanced at Toby, who was now animatedly explaining his new plans for the barn to Hannah, and then at Mrs. Avery, who was rocking gently in her chair, a contented smile on her face. This was what life was meant to be, Garrett thought. A community built on trust, love, and hard work. A place where secrets could no longer fester, where people could start fresh. That evening, after the day's work was done, Garrett and Toby sat on the porch, watching the stars come out one by one. "You know," Garrett said, breaking the comfortable silence, "when I first came back here, I thought I'd made a mistake. I didn't think I belonged." Toby tilted his head, his notepad ready. Garrett smiled at him. "But now, I can't imagine being anywhere else. And that's because of you. Toby, you gave me a purpose, a reason to fight for this place." Toby scribbled something quickly and handed it over. "You're my family now. I finally feel like I belong too." Garrett swallowed the lump in his throat, pulling Toby into a side hug. "You always belonged, kid. You just had to find your way here." Above them, the stars seemed to twinkle brighter, as if the universe itself was celebrating the newfound peace in their corner of the world. For Garrett, Toby, and the town, it was the start of a new chapter, one filled with hope, redemption, and the promise of a brighter tomorrow. Their family, for the farm, and for the town that had become so much more than just a place to live. It was a community filled with hope, resilience, and the power of second chances. As the stars sparkled brightly above, Garrett felt the weight of the past year lift from his shoulders. He glanced at Hannah, who was leaning against him, her head resting on his shoulder, and then at Toby, whose eyes were still fixed on the sky, filled with wonder and contentment. This was everything he hadn't realized he needed, a place where he truly belonged, a family that was chosen and built through love, and a future that was wide open with possibility. "What's next for us?" Hannah asked softly, breaking the silence. Garrett smiled, his hand gently brushing hers. "More of this, I hope. More evenings like this one. More moments to build something lasting. For us. For Toby. For the farm." Toby tapped Garrett's arm and held up his notepad, where he had written, What about the science fair project? It's next week. Garrett chuckled. How could I forget? Of course. That's the top priority. He ruffled Toby's hair affectionately. You're going to blow everyone away with that solar-powered irrigation model. You've put so much work into it. Hannah nodded in agreement. Toby, you're not just showing a project. You're showing what happens when creativity meets determination. I think you're going to inspire more people than you realize. Toby beamed, scribbling a quick note. It's all thanks to you and Garrett. You gave me a chance. Garrett's heart swelled with pride. No, Toby, you did this. You've shown all of us how strong and brilliant you are. We're just here to cheer you on. The three of them sat in a comfortable silence for a while, watching the fireflies dance and the stars shimmer. The world seemed peaceful now, though Garrett knew challenges would come again, as they always did. But he also knew that together, they could face anything. I've been thinking, Hannah said after a while. What if we turn part of the farm into a community space? Maybe a workshop for kids like Toby. A place to learn about sustainability and innovation? Garrett's eyes lit up. That's a fantastic idea. We've got the space, and it could bring the town even closer together. Imagine what it could do for the next generation. Toby nodded enthusiastically, already scribbling plans and sketches on his notepad. We could make it a place where everyone feels welcome, like I do here. Garrett felt his throat tighten again with emotion. Then it settled. We'll make it happen. As the night deepened, the sounds of the farm quieted, leaving only the soft chirping of crickets and the occasional rustle of the breeze through the fields. Garrett leaned back, letting the moment sink in. The farm had once been a burden he never asked for, a legacy that felt impossible to live up to. But now it was so much more. It was the foundation of a life he never could have imagined, built on love, resilience, and the belief that even the most broken things could be mended. Here's to the future, Garrett said, raising an imaginary toast. Toby and Hannah both smiled, joining him in the unspoken sentiment. Together, they watched the night unfold, secure in the knowledge that no matter what lay ahead, they would face it as a family, stronger, braver, and more united than ever.